mighty fortresses are God, our bulwark never failing. Our helper, He amid the flood, our mortal ills prevailing.
So, Hebrews chapter 6, continuing on from where we left off last time, verse 13. Although I'll read from verse 12 because all the sections are connected here. See that you do not become sluggish, but imitate those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. For when God made a promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself, saying, surely blessing I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply you. And so after he had patiently endured, he obtained the promise. For men indeed swear by the greater, and an oath for confirmation is for them an end of all dispute. Thus God, determining to show more abundantly to the heirs of promise the immutability of his counsel, that means the unchangeable nature of his counsel, confirmed it by an oath, that by two immutable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we might have strong consolation, who have fled for refuge to lay hold of the hope set before us. This hope we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, and which enters the presence behind the veil, where the forerunner has entered for us, even Jesus, having become high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. Amen. So last time we were talking about the relationship between apostasy and assurance, and how it is that the threat of apostasy drives the heart of God's people to Christ and to faithfulness. And we said that that faithfulness is the evidence of our salvation. And so in being driven to Christ in faithfulness through the threat of apostasy, we see the certainty of the salvation that God has worked in our hearts. And knowing that we are truly God's, we are brought to the full assurance of hope. Knowing that we are God's children, we know for sure and for certain that everything that he has promised to us will certainly come to pass. And we said that knowing that gives us the motivation to, with faith and patience, endure all, and so inherit the promises. Like a weekend, remember? How do most people get through a tough working week? Because they look forward to the rest and the joy of the weekend before them, and so we look to the everlasting rest that God has prepared for us. And you all know the power of hope. For Joe and for Kate, they're hoping that soon they'll be on the roads driving, and that hope encourages them to take their driving lessons and to practice. For Bassi, he has hopes for work and for family, and that hope drives him to study hard with these various programs that he's been on. And I hope that God will establish his church here in Sunderland for future generations, and that hope drives me on in faithfulness to labor week by week, no matter the discouragements that come my way. But sadly, as we also know, our hopes are uncertain. And because of that, as much as they encourage and they motivate us, they're also a cause of worry and doubts and anxieties within our lives. And you imagine if you could have a certain hope, what a difference that would make. As Rebecca stresses out over assignments through the teacher training, imagine if she could know that for sure at the end of this year she would pass the course and she would get the very best job in the very best school with the very best students, and she would be filled with joy. What a difference that would make to her studies now. And this is the unique joy that you have as Christians. That in Jesus Christ you have a hope unlike any other. Yes. The hope that you have in Jesus Christ is a sure and steadfast hope. Jesus is to you an anchor to your souls. The hope that you have in Christ is a certain hope. And it's for this reason that above all else, we must make sure that our hope is in Jesus. Yes. And so, you might say, well, how can you say the hope in Jesus is certain? Well, I'll tell you how as we go through the text. First, consider God's promise and oath to Abraham. That's the first stage in our argument. Consider God's promise and oath to Abraham. God had made wonderful promises to Abraham. He had promised to be a God to him and to his descendants after him. He had promised to make his name great, to multiply his descendants as the stars of the sky and as the sand of the seashore, to cause them to possess the gates of their enemies, to provide for them an everlasting rest, and in Abraham's seed to bless the nations, to bring the nations to a place of redemption in God. And there was one small problem for Abraham. You may remember that when God began making these promises, Abraham was 75, his wife was 65, and she was barren, aside from the fact that she was well beyond the age of childbearing. But Abraham continued without a child for 25 years, trusting in God. Why? Because he believed that God was faithful. And faithful God was to Abraham. He bore Isaac when he was 100 years old, though his body was, metaphorically speaking, dead. And then came the ultimate test, and we read it in our text earlier. God asked Abraham to take his son, his only son, and to sacrifice him to God, not to murder him, but to hand over his life to the everlasting love of God. And even this Abraham did because he trusted God still. He believed that God would raise his son from the grave. And at that point, God added an oath to the promise that he'd given to Abraham. Verse 13, for when God made a promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself, saying, surely blessing I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply you. And what's so special about the oath that God added? Well, we're told in human terms in verse 16, that an oath for men indeed swear by the greater, and an oath for confirmation is for them the end of all dispute. An oath between men is the highest court of appeal, the highest claim to truth. People still carelessly use oaths in a sinful way today when they say things like, I'm telling you this is so, and I swear on the head of my child that this thing will come to pass. That's a shocking thing. We should never do it. But what people are saying is that the worst thing that could ever happen to me will happen if I'm not telling you the truth. And for Israel, and still for God's people today, actually, we can take an oath in the name of the Lord. And when we do that, and when Israel did that, what they're saying is that God is the most righteous, the most truthful, the most knowing of all beings, and he will hold me to account if I am lying to you. And in this case, God himself took an oath, and he swore by himself in Genesis 22. He says, I will hold myself to account if my promises do not come to pass. Now, for all the oath is given in Genesis 22, it's actually given under another form in Genesis 15. When God cuts a covenant with Abraham, you may remember that Abraham is asked to divide the animals, to cut them in half, and to lay them either side. And what would normally happen is, in a covenant between men, the parties would walk between the animals, invoking the same curse to fall upon them if they break the covenant. But when God cuts the covenant with Abraham, God's presence, the smoking oven and the fiery torch, pass between the animals. In other words, in that gesture, God is saying, if I do not keep my covenant to you, Abraham, may this curse fall upon me. May I cease to exist and be destroyed, which is, of course, impossible. For God is the endless and infinite and eternal source of life. For my promise to fail, God says, I would have to deny who I am, and I would have to cease to be. In effect, heaven and earth, which is upheld by God, would first have to pass away, and then God himself would have to die before his promises failed. But that is impossible. And it is just as impossible then, he says, for these promises to fail. And on that basis, Abraham, verse 15, patiently endured all things and obtained the promise, knowing the absolute certainty of the glory that was held out before him. Abraham endured all things, knowing first, heaven and earth would have to pass away and God would have to cease to be before his promises would fail. And the promises for Abraham in his lifetime began to be fulfilled first in the birth of Isaac when he's 100 years old, and then when he's asked to sacrifice Isaac, in God's returning Isaac to him, and then even in seeing the birth of his grandchildren, Jacob and Esau, and watching them grow into their teen years before he himself then passed into that glory. Now, here's the thing. For the audience that the author to Hebrews is writing to, they know beyond doubt that God's promise and oath were dependable. In their day, who could deny that Abraham's name had been made great? Nobody. He was the hero of the nation, the whole nation of Israel. Who could deny that he had a multitude of descendants? Nobody. They were living proof. They were Abraham's descendants. Who could deny that God had been a God to Abraham and his descendants after him down through the generations for over 1,000 years? Nobody. God was still there being faithful to them. Who could deny that in Abraham's seed the nations of the earth would find their blessing? Nobody. As he writes to the Hebrews here, they're hearing reports throughout the known world that the pagan nations are being converted to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They see with their own eyes that God's promise and oath was reliable because they were seeing the promises to Abraham fulfilled all around them, and you see it too. Yes. Through this, you know the value of God's promise and oath. Because you know today Abraham's name is still great, just as God said it would be. You know today that the nation of Israel exists, just as God said that it would. And you know today that the nations are seeking their refuge in Christ. Christianity is the biggest religion on earth. People from every tribe, nation, and tongue, though until the time of Messiah would have nothing to do with the God of Israel, now are submitting themselves in humility to God. What does that say to you? In these works, God testifies that his word and promise, his salvation and his hope is certain. Yes, what he has promised and sworn by himself has and is coming to pass. So that's the first stage. Consider God's promise and oath to Abraham. But there's more than this. The second stage is this: consider God's promise and oath concerning our great high priest. There's no question that the promise and oath to Abraham is relevant to us. As a very happy Presbyterian, we gladly embrace a doctrine of the covenants, that we are in the same covenant of grace. If you are Christ's, You are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. Just as relevant to us. But a different point is being made here. And the point is this. In the same way as God's promise and oath to Abraham was certain, so too is the promise and oath concerning Jesus Christ as our high priest. Now, I say that because this is the subject of the entire book and this section. Remember, we began in chapter 4 in verse 14 by saying we have a high priest who has passed through the heavens. And then we got to chapter 5 in verse 10, where the author introduced us to that promise in Psalm 110 that Jesus was called by God as high priest according to the order of Melchizedek, of whom, he says, we have much to say. And that is exactly where he's going to in chapter 7 and verse 21. That, just as God made a promise and oath to Abraham, he made a promise and oath concerning a great high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. Verse 21. For they have, 7:21, for they have become priests without an oath, but he with an oath, by him who said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not relent. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. And so, what we need to understand is that there is a switch in our text. In verse 13 to 15, there is a promise and oath made to Abraham. But then when we get to verse 17, thus God determining to show more abundantly to the heirs of promise the unchangeable nature of his counsel, confirmed it by an oath. Not the oath he made to Abraham, though they're related, but the oath he made concerning our high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. So that by two immutable things, the promise and the oath, just like he had done to Abraham, underwritten by the fact that it's impossible for God to lie, we might have strong consolation who have fled for refuge to lay hold of the hope that is set before us. And that line of reasoning is confirmed, I believe, in verse 20 when he leads us on to Jesus again and says that he has become high priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, what this means is that having considered the undeniable proof of God's faithfulness to Abraham, that the nation of Israel exists, that the seed has come, that his name has been made great, you can be just as certain that we have a high priest in the heavens. That we have a high priest who has come with the power of an endless life, 7:16. That we have a high priest who, verse 25 of chapter 7, is able to save to the uttermost those who come to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. That we have a high priest, verse 26, who is holy, harmless, undefiled, and separate from sinners, who, therefore, in verse 27, doesn't need to offer up a sacrifice for his own sins, but has offered up one sacrifice once for all for his people. That we have a high priest who, he began in 4:14, who has passed through the heavens into the presence of God for us, who, as he says in verse 20, as a forerunner, has entered for us into the presence of God. Jesus, who is high priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Just as God swore by himself to Abraham, he swore again concerning Jesus as high priest forever, unless God and the entire universe cease to be. You have a high priest in the heavens who is going nowhere. And the relationship between the two is so important. Again, I ask you the question, did Abraham have a son? Yes. Did Abraham have grandchildren? Yes. Does the nation of Israel exist? Yes. Did the seed of Abraham come and are the nations finding their blessing in him? Yes. Therefore, in the same way, believe that though you can't see him, by the same promise and oath, you have a high priest today and forever before the throne of God in the heavens, who is to you your righteousness, who has provided the atonement that you need from sin, who knows the weakness of your nature and the difficulty of your sojourn on earth, who guarantees the favor of God the Father because he is there representing you before God in his perfect obedience, who takes and receives your prayers and answers them, who is cleansing a universe and preparing an eternal rest for you. It is an understatement to say in verse 18 that we have a strong consolation in laying hold of the hope set before us. The hope that is held out to us concerning Christ our high priest is a hope that is more solid than the ground on which we stand. So consider God's promise and oath to Abraham, and then by comparison, seeing the evidence of that first thing, consider God's promise and oath concerning our great high priest. And there you have all around you the evidence that right now Jesus is at the right hand of the Father, living and breathing and making intercession for you. Now, what does this mean for you? Well, thirdly, consider Jesus then as the anchor of your soul. On the basis of everything we've said, he goes on in verse 19 to say, this hope we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, and which enters the presence behind the veil. He tells the Christians that they have an anchor for their soul that sits before the presence of the Lord. And then he goes on to say that the metaphor presents the position of Christ to us. The anchor goes through the veil into the presence of God, but in verse 20, it's the forerunner who has entered for us, even Jesus, having become high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. Jesus is the anchor of your soul that has passed through the veil and is now in the presence of the Lord. Now imagine a great storm. Darkness descends. High waves are beating down on your ship. And so you set down an anchor. If the anchor doesn't hold, the ship will be torn to pieces, will be crushed by, driven into rocks or some other object. But if the anchor holds, your life is saved. Now, you can't see the anchor once it goes down. It's at the bottom and the depths of the ocean, and you can't see the unbreakable chain that ties your ship to the anchor. But if the anchor holds, your life is saved. And this is Jesus. You can't see him, and you can't see the chain of the Spirit that binds you to Christ, and the storms of life rage around you, but he will hold. That's what we're told. For the barrage of the evil one's punishing waves against you, the discouragements that he sends into your life, the accusations that you are not worthy of God and have no right to stand before God, you are bound to Christ, the one who has destroyed the devil, who has the power of death, the one who has removed his accusations. For all of the devil's discouragements, he will hold the anchor of your soul. For the terrifying rising and falling of the waters. If you've ever watched a cargo ship in a great storm, it's as though it's been taken up onto a mountain and then thrown into the depths of the sea as it falls down the wave. And that's you as you fall and you crash into sin again and again. And yet for that, your soul is bound to the one who is merciful and gracious and will forgive you. And you know what? He will hold. He's going nowhere. He continues to be merciful, gracious, and forgiving to you. In moments of overwhelming distress and exhaustion as you fight the great storm of life, your life continues to be bound to Christ. Your soul is hidden in the bosom of Christ. He holds. And when you cry out to him, he has promised help to you in time of need. When you cry out to him, he answers your cries and he supplies what you need. He holds still. And in the thickest of darkness, when despair takes hold of you, your life continues to be bound to the one who is your hope. And just as following a storm, the ship slowly brings in the anchor, and the ship and the anchor are united again, so you now are bound to Christ, the great anchor of your soul. And slowly but surely, the two of you are being drawn together. And he will come, and when he comes, you'll never be separated from him again physically, and you'll enter into that great and everlasting rest that he has prepared for you, where there are no more storms, there's no more distress, no more darkness, but peace and righteousness and truth and light prevail, and you'll be perfectly blessed in his presence. He will hold the anchor of your soul. How certain is this help and hope that's offered to you? As certain as Abraham's name is great, as certain as the nation of Israel stands today, as certain as souls are being won for Christ from every nation under heaven, as certain as God's unquenchable life and the infinitude of his light, truth, and righteousness, as certain as this, he has sworn and will never change his mind. You have a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek, this great anchor of your soul. You don't see him, but he holds in heaven for you. And therefore, hold on to that one certain hope. As he says in verse 18, for those of you who have fled for refuge, lay hold of the hope that is set before you. There is no other hope in heaven or on earth like the hope of Jesus Christ. Certain, sure, steadfast. And if he is not your hope, you're standing on sinking sand and soft clay, and you'll sink, and you'll be disappointed, and you won't be carried on to the places you wish to go. But Jesus is here for you. He offers himself as the anchor to all who would seek their rest and refuge in him. And he will be your anchor from now, today, until all eternity. And so may we all run for refuge to Jesus Christ, that certain hope, and then continue on with faith and endurance, knowing that we have him as an anchor of our souls in the heavenly places, and that one day he's coming back for you. Amen.